Okay, just curious, how many of you at kind of at this point in our series through 1 Corinthians are just really sick of hearing about meat and idols? Is there anybody else? I know I talked to Lene Brenize last week, and she actually said if she heard anyone at church mention the word meat and idols in the same sentence, she was just going to walk right out. And she's not here today, so I don't know what that tells you. The good news is this is the last week that we're going to be talking about this particular topic. Next week, on to a new chapter, whole new section in the letter. Actually, big new topic. Jack Wilsey's got it covered, literally, because the topic is women in head coverings. So it's going to be, buckle up, come back for that one. We're just really trying to keep things real here in the dog days of August. But before we get there, we've still got our passage today, 1 Corinthians 10:23 to 11:1. Should Christians eat flesh that's been sacrificed to images? Get what I'm saying there? This passage really is Paul's final word on this topic, like his summary of everything he's been, working toward in the last 3 chapters. But it's not all just recap. He actually kind of adds some new twists to the arguments that he's been making, some stuff we haven't been considering yet. And then Paul sums really everything up with one principle, this principle that I think has been in the background of everything he's been saying, and it's restated actually 9 different times in our little section right here. That principle is love. That is really the key word of this passage today, the key word of 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10, all 3 of those chapters, love. Love is the basis for all the instructions that Paul gives in this passage. In fact, you could make the case that love really is the basis of every instruction that you see in the Bible. Matthew 22, 35 through 40. And one of them, a lawyer, asked Jesus a question to test him. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And he, Jesus, said to him, the lawyer, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second commandment is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments, Jesus says, depend all the law and the prophets. The scriptures depend on these 2 commandments. They hang on them. Every commandment is grounded in love. Really, love in 2 directions, vertical and horizontal. Love for God, first and foremost. That would be the vertical aspect of this love. And then love for others, the horizontal aspect. Love your neighbor as yourself. Everything that God tells you to do in his word falls into one of these 2 categories, without exception. They are all grounded in love. And here's the weird thing. The word love doesn't actually appear in our passage today. It doesn't. It's not there. It's conspicuously absent, I would say, because love is really what this passage is all about. Love of God that prompts us to, flee from idols, what we talked about last week in the first half of chapter 10, and then love of neighbor, which prompts us to do everything that Paul says here in the last half of chapter 10. And I love this aspect of the passage, actually, the conspicuous absence of the word love, because I think by leaving the word love out of this, Paul actually shows us love in greater clarity. What is love? That is a question that every single person must answer. If we are to love God with all of our hearts, if we're to love our neighbor as ourselves, well, we can't do that if we don't define love. So what is it? What is love? I'm kind of curious, did anyone here in their brain have kind of an almost Pavlovian response where you immediately filled in the words, baby, don't hurt me? After that, Tammy and Ken? I thought so. That was kind of, 1993. You guys were probably dancing to that song in the clubs. But it raises a good question. What is love? Love is the slipperiest word in the English language, says Eugene Peterson. There is no other word in our society more messed up, misunderstood, perverted, and misused as the word love. And he's right. You know, you don't even have to look further than the stall of one of your favorite bathrooms to figure this out. Here's a picture of the wall of the stall of a bathroom at a coffee shop by my house. Love will find a way is written there in black pen. It's the original graffiti, I think, as I analyze this. And then as you can see, some bitter savant with a Sharpie crossed that out and said, tear us apart again. Love will not find a way. Love will tear us apart again. Obviously, you know, even armchair philosophers go through a bad breakup now and then. Then the next graffiti artist, this is new handwriting, saw what had been crossed out, and he thought, you know what? I will raise your crossing out and actually scratch you out, and then write the word prevail, scratched in there, permanently. Right? This self-authenticating statement proven by the fact that his scratching out prevailed over the other statement. Then the discussion continues. Someone wrote the word yup right there with an arrow. And then this is the weirdest part. Up here at the very top, you can't really read it, but that handwriting actually looks suspiciously like Earl Oliver's. And what it asks right there is, let's see if I can find it here. Oh, if nothing lasts forever, then why is love the exception? Doesn't that sound like something Earl would write? I thought that when I saw it. This is the wisdom of the bathroom stall. I can't wait to see where the discussion goes next. I'm probably going to try to use this bathroom every day next week, see what happens. But my guess is none of these graffiti gurus will really get us any closer to the answer to the question that we're asking, what is love? If Eugene Peterson were to use this bathroom, which he might, he lives in Vancouver, so it's not outside of the realm of possibility, here's what I think he would write on the wall. A dictionary is worthless in understanding and practicing love. Love, he says, is the most context-specific act in the entire spectrum of human behavior. There is no other single human act more dependent on and more immersed in immediate context. Paul would agree with Peterson, I think, or better, Peterson agrees with Paul. You cannot define love apart from a context. You cannot define love apart from a person. Love as a verb is never abstract. It's relational when it's given in the Bible. It's concrete, not just love in general, but love God, the God who made you, the God who is there. Love your neighbor, that person right there in front of you with, you know, the bad teeth and the bad breath. Love them, the Bible says. Love can only be understood in context. And that context is exactly what Paul gives us right here in our passage today. Paul doesn't use the word love in this passage. He shows it. He doesn't discuss love in the abstract. He illustrates it in its context. This is just what we need to catch this slippery word and impress it upon our hearts. Not a concept, but an example. Not a list of characteristics, but ultimately a person, a flesh and blood definition of the word love. So I want you to think of this passage kind of like a sandwich, all right? First two verses, 23 and 24, they're like one slice of bread. The last four verses, 31 through 11, they're like the other slice of bread. They're both kind of emphasizing this basic command to love. And then the meat of the sandwich, pun intended, is the specific context for that love. An actual, flesh and blood, steaks on the grill type of scenario that the Corinthians could encounter on a regular basis, and how they could act in that scenario in a way that expresses love. So in light of this structure, we're kind of going to look at this passage in a weird sort of way today. We're going to start in the middle, all right? We're going to start with that meat section, with the example that Paul gives, and then we're going to work our way out to the bread, those 8 specific ways that Paul describes love. I know it's a little bit weird to do it this way, but this This is the way my 2-year-old son eats every single sandwich that he encounters. So, it's good enough for him, should be good enough for us too. So here we go, starting in the middle, the contexts. Situation number 1, meat sold in the market. Again, really, you could say this is the context. The number one question that the Corinthians were asking Paul, they lived in this city that was just saturated with idols, idol worship. Often after a big religious festival, there'd be piles of this, half-price meat for sale in the marketplace, and meat that had, in all likelihood, been sacrificed to an idol just the night before, maybe a couple days before. So can we eat this meat in good conscience as followers of Jesus? Paul's answer, both here and really throughout this section, is yes. Verse 25, eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Yes, you can eat that meat. That meat is part of God's creation. God's creation is good. You can enjoy it. That part there is at the end is actually a quotation from the Psalms, Psalm 24. And Paul quotes this because there was this strain of thought, especially among the Greeks at the time, that kind of the material universe, the stuff of flesh and blood and matter, that was kind of inferior to the spiritual world, like the realm of ideas and images. Like that's where kind of true goodness and beauty resides. Well, Paul really stands squarely against this kind of thinking in this quotation here. The earth is the Lord's and its fullness thereof, meaning it's all his. God created the material world, and he called it good, very good even. It all belongs to him. Every rock, tree, every mountain, every pig, every goat, every cow that might be sold in the meat market, it all belongs to God. You belong to God. You can eat the meat. This is really Christian freedom in a nutshell. And this is where this discussion needs to start as a starting point, Christian freedom. Context number 2 does not fall into the category of freedom, and that is the temple. Really, this is a callback to last week's passage that we discussed in detail, where Paul issues that firm call to flee idolatry, that should have no place in the Christian life. The concept that he's referring to here, that specific context, is probably worshiping or eating a feast in an actual temple of an idol. Again, another common thing in Corinth, an important part of life in the city. Temples had, these little banquet rooms set up all over the grounds with these hanging lanterns and gardens and, just a gorgeous table that you could rent out for feasts or parties or whatever. But all of this was done in the presence of an idol, in honor of an idol, in the name of an idol. So you can't do this, says Paul. No matter how much you want to go, no matter the social or financial or interpersonal cost that you might have to deal with as a result of saying no to the invitation, you cannot dine in the temple of an idol. That's idolatry. That is a big no. That's not an area of Christian freedom. Okay, point granted. The Corinthians would probably say, we get it. No idols. Covered that last week. So what about context number 3 that we haven't talked about yet? The home. Verse 27. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. I do not mean your conscience, but his. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced of that for which I give thanks? Boy, I'll tell you what, this is a very important passage of Scripture for any Christian wondering how they can live faithfully in a culture that is hostile to the ways and message of Jesus. Because basically the situation that Paul's describing right here is when a Christian gets invited to, a dinner party in the home of someone who is not a Christian. Again, this could be a common situation in Corinth, especially among the middle or the upper classes. You have friends, they have dinner parties, a lot of the same stuff as you would have at like feasts at a temple, probably on a little bit of a lesser scale, more backyard burgers than the catered lobster tail, but still, In these home-hosted dinner parties, there was a high likelihood that some, if not all, of the meat that was being served there had been offered to idols in the past. Can you eat it then? They wondered. And yes, Paul says, go for it. Eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. Meaning you don't need to go like all Inspector Clouseau style and ask, where did you buy this meat? How was it slaughtered? Has it come in contact with any idols or idol temples in the last 36 hours? And no, Paul says, don't do it. Just eat it. That's where he starts again. Christian freedom. All things are permissible. Pass the pork chop. I should point out that this is just really a very sharp departure from Paul's Jewish past, especially since Paul was part of that Jewish sect known as the Pharisees, who were very strict about this sort of thing. They were like the master interrogators when it came to food, asking, this whole list of questions before anything would pass their lips, just to make sure it wasn't unclean or, tainted by pagan associations of some kind. Certain groups of devout Jews still operate this way today. I remember I was with my family down at the Tillamook Cheese Factory, 15 years ago, and, we were looking down through the glass, and they got these big bricks of cheese going down the conveyor belt to go be shipped off and stuff, and there was this guy walking around with a hairnet on and looking at all this stuff, and he had a big old beard, and our tour guide said that was the local rabbi, and that he comes in once a week just to make sure that all their processes are certified kosher. And I remember this vividly because he had actually not just a hairnet, but a beard net on. And I had never seen a beard net before, and I thought that was very unique. But anyways, this is what Paul says we don't have to do as Christians. You can buy whatever cheese you guys want and enjoy it tonight. It doesn't need to be certified kosher, any of that. Eat whatever has been set before you. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. I do not mean your conscience, but his. Now, this right here, this is one of those unique twists in this discussion that we haven't encountered yet. One of the key places that Paul makes clear that horizontal love, our obligation to love our neighbor as ourselves, always trumps your individual Christian freedom. Always. Most likely the informant here, that would be this, the someone who says to you, most likely that person is an unbeliever. It's maybe even the host of the party who, before the meal is served, discreetly informs you, or maybe publicly informs you, we don't really know, that this meat has been offered to an idol. Maybe, he does it in that kind of discreet way out of sensitivity, like he knows that you're a Christian and that you don't want to have a lot of stuff to do with idols. That's not really your thing. So he tells you, hey, this has been offered to idols, and, you should avoid it. He also could be doing it, if he does it publicly, he could be attempting to shame you in front of everyone. Wait till all the stuff has been served, and he says, oh, by the way, this has been offered to idols. And then you got a really awkward moment with your fork in your hand. Either way, if an unbeliever explicitly tells you that the meat that you're about to eat has been offered to idols, you cannot eat it. Not because it's wrong for you, Paul says, but because doing so would be harmful to them, the person who told you. How so? Well, in their eyes, if you went ahead and ate this meat after they told you that it had been sacrificed to idols, it could be seen in a number of harmful ways. One of those is it could just be seen as an endorsement of idolatry. Like, by eating this meat, you're basically saying, hey, this idolatry stuff, not really that bad. It's not really that big of a deal. You worship idols in the temple. I eat their meat at the parties. Why are we stressing out about this? Your neighbor then would have no warning for him to turn from dead idols to the worship of the true and living God. So by your eating, and really by your silence in that case, you will have just kind of gently nudged your neighbor down to keep walking what C.S. Lewis would call that smooth and easy road to hell. That is not an example of loving your neighbor. You're not being offensive, true, but you're also not being loving. Another negative way your actions could be viewed, in this case, if you just went ahead and ate that meat after they told you it was sacrificed to idols, is just as serious, and that could be seen as hypocrisy. Your neighbor would know that your religion forbids you eating meat that, is idolatry, but he would figure you're just being a hypocrite. Sure, you know it's wrong, but yeah, I'll just do it this once. And again, by your actions, you're simply giving your neighbor another excuse not to take God's commands seriously, and really an excuse not to take God himself seriously, because clearly you don't either. If your neighbor tells you that you're about to dine on sacrificial meat, don't eat it, Paul says. And again, you're doing this for your neighbor's sake, not for your sake. Paul hits the freedom theme again in the last two verses of example. For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? Well, you're not, Paul's saying. These are rhetorical questions. If your neighbor wasn't in the picture, you'd be free to eat. Just start slathering on the barbecue sauce. Go for it. But your freedom must always be tempered by love. Christian freedom is not primarily freedom from, but freedom for. It's really the principle that I hope that you get out of this. Christian freedom is not from, meaning from rules or restrictions or regulations or any of that, but freedom for a greater purpose, and that purpose is love. Love of God and love of neighbor. When you get this principle, it really means that you look at this whole situation, in every situation, with a different set of questions. Not what is permissible or lawful for me, what can I get away with, but what is loving for others? How can I use my freedom in Jesus for the good of other people, in this case, the good of my neighbor? There is some deep, deep wisdom in this principle, wisdom that I think is far too often neglected by we Christians when we kind of try to work through some of these difficult moral issues. I actually think there's a lot of applicable wisdom right here to the question of whether or not a Christian should attend a gay wedding. A situation some of you might have found yourself in or may find yourself in the near future where you've been invited to attend a same-sex wedding. What should you do? I'm actually going to try to address that specific question as an application of this passage in the second half of our service today. So after a few worship songs, I'll do that. So, if you're watching on YouTube or listening on the podcast, all you vacationers and campers out there, keep watching after the prayer. There's going to be some bonus content. But solving this particular moral dilemma is not really Paul's purpose in this passage. He wants to call all of us, including his readers, to something much higher. Nothing less than loving your neighbor as yourself right here, right now, in your context. What is that context for you? I think of Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. The reason that Jesus told really this now famous story was because the people around him at the time, like most of us, were looking for loopholes. Jesus had just restated these two bedrock commands of Scripture, to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then someone in the crowd, a lawyer again, go figure, asks this: who then is my neighbor? Meaning, I can't love everyone, Jesus. Surely you realize this. So draw some boundaries for me. Give me some guidelines to make this, more realistic, more concrete for me. So Jesus does just that, really. He takes this question out of the abstract and he puts it in the street. This street where the man lies bloody and naked on the ground in need of help. What I would like right now is for everyone here to ask the lawyer's question. Who then is my neighbor? Who is God asking you to love right now? This isn't that hard of a question, really. The answer that Jesus gives in the story is basically another question. Who's in front of you? Like if you're walking down the road and someone is lying there beaten and bloody, guess what? That person is your neighbor. No matter their race, no matter their social status, no matter, how much other important stuff you've got to do that day, no matter how much it costs you, they are your neighbor. You must love them as yourself. This is what the Samaritan did. Go and do likewise, Jesus says. So who is this for you? Who is in front of you right now in your life that God is asking you to love? If you can, I would like it if you could literally fill in the blank. Right now, God is asking me to love. Who is it? Whose name could you write right there in the blank? You know, my hope is that this last section of the sermon could just be as concrete and specific as possible for all of you. And I mean, really, that's the only way that love can be understood, right? Love must have a context. So who is God asking you to love right now? Maybe it's your literal neighbor, you know, that obnoxious family with the barking dog and all the weeds that they throw over your fence all the time. Maybe it's your manager at work, the one who slacks off all the time and then blames you for her lack of output. Maybe it's your roommate. Maybe it's your brother, your sister, your parents, your spouse. Maybe that's why you didn't write their name down, because they're sitting right next to you and it could be awkward. Maybe it's your 2-month-old baby. Who is in front of you right now? Who are you tempted to, instead of love, maybe withdraw from or attack or punish in some way? Who are you tempted to abandon or avoid? And how instead can you move toward them in love? This is where the rest of this passage comes in. The bread, what love looks like. Because Paul doesn't just leave us on our own to figure out what love is. He gives us a picture. 9 pictures, actually, the 9 blanks that are on the back of your notes there. Want to know what love looks like, he's saying? I won't define it for you. I won't even mention the word love in this passage. Instead, I will show you. Here is what love looks like. And the first on the list is that love looks like help. Verse 23, all things are lawful, that Corinthian declaration of freedom, and Paul's response of love, but not all things are helpful. Help is just a very practical word. It implies assistance, could be major or minor. It implies, seeing a need and then acting on it, like a good Samaritan. It's like love with a pair of work gloves, or love with a sack of groceries in your trunk, or it's just love with simply a kind word on your lips. Now think of that person that you listed in the blank. Do they need help in some way? Are they hurting? Are they lonely? Are they weak? Are they tired? Are they wounded? Is there some terrible backstory in their life you don't even know about that makes them so difficult for you to love? This sort of condition of neediness is actually presupposed in the next picture of love, which is construction, building up. A verse that's almost the mirror of the previous one. All things are lawful, yes, Paul says, but love requires that whatever you do also builds up, a word that's often translated edifies, constructs, just really the common word for building a building. That's what it is right there. We should not be surprised when the people that God puts before us are broken in deep and significant ways. That shouldn't be like, what is wrong with you? No, we should expect that from each other. It's implied by this word right here, building up. We need building up because we are broken down. Broken down people are often cruel, unkind, manipulative. Broken people break other people. It's a sad fact of living in this world that's so messed up by sin. And those of us who are being rebuilt, we who by Jesus, through his Spirit, are being made into new people, we have an obligation to then help rebuild others. This means that love must also be active. The next blank. Let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. Seek, Paul says, meaning, strive after, search after, like a person who's, lost their phone or misplaced it. Where is it? How can I find it? If you're seeking something, last time you lost something, think about that. It can consume you, thinking about it day and night, wondering where it is. Well, this is the sort of attitude that we should have for the good of our neighbor. Actively thinking about it, not just passively waiting for some opportunity. Especially not waiting for them to ask for our love or then somehow demonstrate they're worthy of our love, but seeking their good at your cost no matter what. When was the last time that you like brainstormed how you could show love to that person in the blank? When was the last time that you thought about it, wondered about, how you could seek their good the same way that you would wonder where your phone is if you had misplaced it? That is love, Paul says, seeking their good on their terms, not your terms. Jumping down now to verse 31. So, whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Meaning, love looks like worship. When you love this way, when you actively seek the good of your neighbor rather than your own good, this constitutes an act of worship that is more meaningful to God than almost anything else. Another quotation from Matthew. Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you? Or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you? Or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly, I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. Nothing brings honor and glory to Jesus like loving the person in front of you, even when it's difficult. Or better, especially when it's difficult. The more difficult the love, the richer the glory that God receives. Even if the person that you wrote in that blank never thanks you, even if they meet every single act of love that you try to give them with ingratitude or dismissal, maybe even resentment, their reaction isn't the point. It never has been, it never will be. The point is honoring and glorifying God, the intersection of these two great commandments, loving God by loving others. This is beautiful. This is glorifying. This is what love looks like. Next, sensitivity. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do. This really goes back to loving others on their terms, not on your terms, and this requires sensitivity. Cultural sensitivity for one, religious sensitivity for another, knowing what would seem offensive, be seen as offensive by a Jew or a Greek and avoiding that. Knowing what would seem unnecessarily offensive to your atheist coworker, or your Buddhist neighbor, or your transgender neighbor, or any other category that you can think of. Have you taken the time to get to know them? Do you know what things would bother them? Do you know how to speak their language on different levels? We need to avoid unnecessary offense. It's part of love. One of the key words there is unnecessary, because there are aspects of the gospel that will always be offensive. Paul states this at the start of the letter. He says, the message of Christ crucified is a stumbling block to the Jews and it's folly to the Greeks. That aspect is unavoidable. But there's a lot of stuff that we do that is avoidable that could really be an unnecessary barrier for people to hear the message of Jesus Christ. We need to be sensitive to that. And that's because everyone needs this sort of love. Christian love must be universal. Just look at these really broad, inclusive terms that Paul uses throughout this passage. Whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, do all to the glory of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do. And then you've got those three categories there: Jew, Greek, church of God. In Paul's way of thinking, that's really everyone in the world. Jews would be those people who follow the law of Moses. The church of God, those who follow the way of Jesus. And Greeks would pretty much mean anyone who follows anything else. It's his way of saying you must love all people, no matter their race, no matter their place of origin, their language, no matter their religion. There is no name which you could have written in that blank which you are not obligated to love, period. Who is my neighbor, you ask? Whoever's in front of you, Jesus says. You must seek their advantage, which means that love is inherently unfair. Not seeking my own advantage, but that of many. Loving the person that you wrote in the blank will cost you something. If it doesn't, it's not really love. It will disadvantage you almost always. Loving that person will require you to give without receiving, require you to share in a way that actually sets you back, maybe emotionally, maybe financially, maybe socially, maybe even physically when you get tired. Living a life of love will put you at a disadvantage, for the benefit of another person. Love is unfair. You really need to know this going into it. It's not give and take. It is give and give when you're seeing love from a Christian perspective. You need to embrace this, Paul is saying. Their advantage, not yours. Because you know what else is very unfair? It's salvation through Jesus, that they may be saved. Christian love is always intentional. It's always done with the end game in mind, not their short-term relief, from discomfort or loneliness or financial hardship or whatever other ways this person might legitimately need help, but we're always looking for the long-term good of the other person's soul, finding freedom, forgiveness, life in Jesus. So again, think about that person that you wrote in the blank. Are they a Christian? If they are, that's great. What that means, your goal should be, by your love, help them stay rooted and established in the love of Jesus so they might stay faithful to the end in this world that is full of hardship and temptation. This is why you love your neighbor. That is how you love your neighbor. And then if the person that you wrote in the blank is not a Christian, then that's where your task gets even more urgent, because your goal is to introduce them to the saving knowledge of Jesus, and you do this through your love. Last blank. If we only had this one, it would be enough. Love looks like Jesus. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. This is the part of the sermon where I tell you that all along we've been asking the wrong questions. What is love? We asked. What does love look like? We asked after that. And those questions will never completely give us the answer we need, because the question we actually need is, who does love look like? Right here, Paul is inviting us to learn the definition of love, not through a dictionary, not through a list of principles, most definitely not through the wall of a bathroom stall. Paul is asking us to learn love through a person, through Jesus. We know love by this, John says, that Jesus laid down his life for us. Or as Paul says right there in those 6 words, imitate me as I imitate Christ. There is no better definition of love than the person of Jesus. I mean, think about it. Jesus embodies every aspect of love that we see on that list. Jesus is the ultimate helper with a capital H. He's the friend of sinners, the rescuer, the savior. He's the ultimate builder. He's the renovator of the human heart. He begins by rebuilding you. He goes on to build a community, and his ultimate goal is to rebuild the world, new creation, resurrection, world without end. And he's active in pursuing this project like we must be. The ultimate seeker, the shepherd who leaves, the 99 sheep to pursue the one that wandered the way. The Son of Man who, in his own words, came to seek and save the lost. Jesus embodies remarkable sensitivity and awareness of the needs of others, healing the sick, embracing the lepers, forgiving, the adulterers with soft words and tenderness, while on other times calling the Pharisees a pit of snakes and making his belt into a whip when he has to. He knew what people needed. He was sensitive to their needs and acted accordingly in a spirit of love, whatever that was. And the next thing on that list, glory. Paul uses this title, Lord of Glory, one time in reference to Jesus in this letter, just once. And he does it while talking about his crucifixion. Back in chapter 1, they crucified the Lord of Glory. The lowest point of Jesus' life, his death on a Roman cross, the lowest point of shame that these Corinthians could possibly imagine was actually, Paul says, the high water mark of Jesus' glory, because it is right there that we see his love the clearest. The cross is the ultimate example of unfairness, of unfair love, seeking the advantage of others at your disadvantage. There has never been and there never will be a more unfair event than what took place at the place of the skull under the rule of Pontius Pilate on the Friday before the Passover. There never has been, there never will be. Because right there, the creator of all things, the perfect Lamb of God, was dying in real space, in real time, a flesh and blood example of love for the people that he created. All for the purpose of our rescue, that many may be saved. We know love by this, John says. Jesus laid down his life for us, and so we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. Really, what Paul is giving us here at the end of this, big 3-chapter discussion of idols and living as neighbors and friends in this hostile pagan culture, what Paul is giving us here is a striking 2-part invitation. 1, I am invited to know the definition of love through knowing Jesus. And then 2, the people around me are invited to know the definition of love through knowing me. That's your name that's supposed to go in the blank right there. That's why it's left open. Your calling, your vocation. The people around me are invited to know the definition of love through knowing Nate Corley, through knowing Jack Howard, through knowing Darcy Weber. Put your name there. This is your calling. This is your vocation. It's what Paul is calling us to here. It's nothing more, it's nothing less than the imitation of Jesus Christ. Knowing love through knowing him, and then showing love in both radical and very ordinary ways every single day. Imitate me as I imitate Christ. What Paul is saying is that the person that you wrote in the blank on the front should never have to ask the question, what is love? Your kids should never have to ask the question, what is love? Your neighbors should never have to ask that question. Your coworkers should never have to ask that question, or your roommate, or anyone else who is around you. They should never have to wonder, because you know Jesus and they know you. Love not in the abstract, not in the philosophical or the hypothetical, but love in the flesh, your flesh, broken for them, just as Jesus' flesh was broken for you. And then they'll be invited to join in this dance themselves. This cycle of giving love, a cycle of receiving love, showing love, a cycle of never-ending joy that begins and ends with Jesus, love made flesh. Pray with me, please. Father, the love that you have shown us through Jesus is something that we could spend the rest of today meditating on, the rest of this week, the rest of this year, the rest of our lives, and only be getting to grasp perhaps the edges of the height, the breadth, and the depth of the love that you have demonstrated for us. By your Spirit, O God, open our eyes. By your Spirit, fill us with the love of your Son so that we may pour out that love on others. We pray this all in his name. Amen. Like I hinted at during the message a little bit earlier, but kind of an interesting area of application for this particular passage today is when it comes to this question: should I attend a gay wedding? Some of you have been in this situation before where, say, you've got like a friend that, maybe you've kept in touch with all the way since high school. You guys see each other once a month or whatever, and he's been to your son's wedding, and now he invites you to his son's wedding, but his son is marrying another man. I know this isn't your thing, the friend says, but could you please come to this wedding? It would mean so much to me, so much to my son. What then should you, as a Christian, do in this situation? Well, I actually think what we read here in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, all three of these chapters, can be really helpful to use as we kind of think through this sort of question. First and foremost, kind of that principle that runs all the way through, is that our motivation should be love, right? Love of God first and foremost, love of our neighbor second. So what that does is it helps you immediately rule out any answer to this question that you might give that is either self-serving or self-protective in motivation. In other words, not motivated by love. That should just be, you can cross those off the list right away, all right? The second principle that we see is this: an invitation to overt sin. This would be analogous, I guess, to the idolatry commands that Paul gives in the first half of chapter 10. Going and eating in the feast of an idol, or actually bowing down and worshiping an idol. This would be something that is clearly prohibited by Scripture, that the Bible says no to in black and white, an overt violation in this case of the first commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me. It's off limits, right? In this case, going to a gay wedding, I don't think is analogous to this category of overt sin. The Bible is clear that same-sex sexual behavior is a sin. There are clear commands against this throughout the Bible. We've taught this extensively in the last year. If you want to look those messages up, sexual activity is reserved for man and woman only within the context of a marriage only. So to fall into this category here, what you would have to be doing is actually engaging in some sort of same-sex sexual behavior. Like this would be if you were one of the two people getting married. Or if by going to the wedding, you would actually be participating in some sort of sexual immorality while you're there. Highly unlikely. So if all we had was what Paul says in this category right here, don't engage in overt sin, you could probably go to the wedding. Kind of that principle of freedom. If it's not a direct command, all things are lawful, right? However, there's a lot more that Paul says. Principle number 2, the stumbling block principle. And this goes all the way back to chapter 8, which Randy taught on, like a month ago now. Time flies. Where Paul says that if eating meat, something you're free to do, causes another brother to stumble, meaning, tempted to then return to a life of idolatry, then don't do it. This would be like someone who used to worship idols in the past, now belongs to Jesus, but still struggles with this temptation to return to the security and the tangibility of idols and idol worship every single day. And then they see you eating that meat that you bought at the market that had been sacrificed to idols. And wow, they think, man, if Randy's okay with eating that meat, maybe it's okay for me to eat that meat too. And so they do it. And then before they know it, they're drawn back into a life of full-blown idolatry. So don't do this, Paul says. If exercising your freedom causes another person to be tempted to go back to a pattern of sin, which would make it a stumbling block, you can't do it. So in this case, the question you would need to ask before attending a gay wedding would be this: will this action be a stumbling block to any of my fellow believers who hear that I'm doing this? Meaning, is there someone who has struggled with their sexual identity or sexual behavior in the past who will see you exercising your freedom in this way and think, man, if Randy's going to that gay wedding, well, maybe that sort of sexual sin isn't so bad after all. Maybe I'm taking all of this too seriously. Maybe I need to lighten up a little bit. And before you know it, the exercise of your freedom has caused another brother or sister to stumble. If that is the case, don't do it, Paul says. But there's a third category that also must be considered, and one that we far too often neglect, and I think the most important in this discussion, the unbeliever's conscience. What will your attendance at this wedding communicate to your friend, to any of the other unbelievers in attendance, or to any of the other unbelievers who hear that you have attended, either through social media or just conversation or whatever? This is such an important question to consider, and it's a difficult one to consider. It's like Paul says in our passage today, if you have been invited to a friend's house and they serve you meat, just go ahead and eat it. Don't ask any questions. Don't ask if, has this been offered to idols or not? You're free. Just enjoy the meal, enjoy your friends. However, if they tell you specifically that this meat has been offered to idols, like this is the meat's origin, this is the meat's purpose, is to bring honor and glory to this idol, then don't eat it for the sake of conscience. Not your conscience, but his. Why? Because eating that meat would communicate any number of things, all of them actually harmful to your neighbor, not loving. It would either communicate, like I said in the sermon, either that you're a hypocrite, sliding back on what this person knows to be your principles, or that Christian principles don't matter that much. Like they're more, suggestions from God, not hard and fast guidelines that we are bound to follow no matter what. Or worst of all, you could be communicating that God himself doesn't matter that much. He's just one God among many. You worship him one day, you eat this meat to an idol the next. Not that special of a God. Either way, you're eating this meat after you have been specifically informed that it's been offered to idols is unloving and uncaring toward your neighbor, because it gives him an unspoken affirmation of his worship of idols. It's like your tacit endorsement, your silent, thumbs up to his current way of life. So the question we really need to wrestle with in light of this is, what does it communicate if you choose as a Christian to attend a gay wedding? What does it communicate? In our culture, there's really no such thing as a passive audience at a wedding. You are there as witnesses, actually, to really affirm and solemnize the proceedings. The eating, the toasts, the dancing, the gifts, even your attire, like what you wear to a wedding. By dressing up, you're doing that to affirm and celebrate the union of these two persons. And you know this going into it. It's kind of the equivalent, I think, of being told where this meat has come from, what its purpose is. Can you then partake of the celebration? Often the invitations even say you're invited to celebrate or to join us in celebration, right? It's clear. And I realize this is a really difficult decision to make. If you're a Christian who's been invited to a gay wedding for someone that you really care about, maybe someone that you have actually been praying for years, someone who's close to you, someone you've worked so hard to build and establish this relationship with, and then you're worried that all of that relationship is just going to be completely undermined by one refusal to attend one event. This, refusal that might just come across really as a self-righteous snub if you're not careful about it. I mean, that is a terrible situation to be in. It's really difficult. But for the sake of conscience, I think you should say no. Not your conscience, but his and any other unbeliever who might see you there or hear that you're going. Ultimately, it's a question that's difficult and murky. I mean, one of the things we always want to do is affirm the person, not their behavior. The difficulty of this in a wedding is that in our culture, sexual identity has become so bound up that behavior equals identity. In the mind of the unbeliever, you can't affirm me without affirming my behavior. You reject my behavior, you're rejecting me. Very difficult position to be in. There's also a lot of other complicating factors I didn't mention that probably if you've been in this situation or considering this situation, you've brought up in your mind. That's why really when it comes down to this, you are the one who needs to make this decision. That's how, these questions of conscience work, like Randy and Earl made so clear when we did the panel up here a few weeks ago. You think it through. You ask all these questions. You will be the one who is held accountable for the choices you make. Not before me, not before Randy or Bruce or any of the other elders. You will be held accountable before God and God only. And some good news. Randy said when I shared this part of the message with him earlier this week, he said, you've got to include this because this is so important. We are all operating from a standpoint of total security as we wrestle with these issues. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that you will make the wrong decision sometimes. You will try to do the right thing and you won't. We all fail in these matters of conscience. We even fail in matters of clarity. And every mistake that we might make is covered by God's grace in Jesus. It is so important to remember that. So wrestle with these questions, figure out what's right, and then go forth in confidence because you go forth in freedom. Now, like I said, there's a lot more that can be said about this. There's actually an article back at the welcome desk. Dee, can you give us a little wave? There she is. I made 50 copies of this article by Kevin DeYoung that really lays out a lot more on this topic. So if you want one, get them while they're still there, or you can email me this week and I can send you the link digitally so that you can read it. I should also say that the principles right here that we've been discussing apply in a lot of other situations. A lot of the other questions you guys sent us when we did those questions of conscience. One of them that you sent us was, should Christian boyfriend and girlfriends be allowed to do sleepovers with each other, where they're in the same house or they're in the same bed as long as nothing sexual happens, right? Or should Christians be able to attend worship services at a non-Christian place of worship, like at a Mormon meeting or at a Buddhist temple? Should we do that? What questions should we ask when considering this? Well, it's just the questions that just flashed across the screen right there. Those are the questions I think that Paul would have us ask if we were writing him any of these questions, including that most important one that we so often neglect: what does this communicate to my non-believing neighbors? We must love our neighbors as ourselves, even if that love comes at great personal or social cost.